Thank you for coming. I'm your host, Sagar, and today I'm having a really good speaker. He has a passion for impact, and whatever he does always works for big dreams. Here is Maurice Borjesson. Can I have a warm applause, please?
Today I will do something very unusual, and I'll crawl out of my comfort zone in parking, roughly 20, 30 centimeters out of that comfort zone, in fact, and up on to the sidewalk. Because today we're going to speak a little bit about the sidewalk. Before jumping into that, though, I would like to make a small disclaimer. I'm going to make some claims here today, but we have only 30 minutes. And so I'm going to cut some corners. And whenever you think that's pretty arrogant, please give me the benefit of the doubt, because otherwise we're not going to make it on time. And just for context then, I would like to jump in and say, why are we actually looking at sidewalks? So the space between buildings and parks is distributed roughly along these lines. So about half of that space is roads. And that's probably no surprise to anybody in this room. But as the roads got more crowded, that also gave way to parking space. So the roads got regulated first, and then the parking spaces got regulated second. And sidewalks are then the next chunk of big block of real estate in the cities. And they make up roughly then 25% of that space. And so the rest of space is made up by other stuff, and I'm sure there's going to be a talk on how we take care of that later. But for today, we're going to jump into the sidewalk space. And our cities are changing, and with them the sidewalks, and here's a nice eatery. But I want to talk about some observable phenomena that's happening on our sidewalks. So the first one is this. And they used to be not that common before, but now you start to see them in many places. And these are bags for construction waste disposal. And they have made life in cities that much better, because now you can work on refurbishments or other kind of things as a city dweller in your apartment, and that is not expensive and not complicated. It's really easy to get rid of the stuff, so this is amazing innovation. So the next thing that has happened to a very large degree is on-demand food delivery. And in this particular case, by regular bike, and you see them parked next to doorways or in the vicinity of the pickup points of where they actually pick up the food. You've seen that. And so the next one is basically the same idea, but this one is motor propelled, but parked in the same way, not unusually on sidewalks. We've got bike sharing. And we've got these things, electric scooters. They can be private, owned by private individuals, or they can be part of sharing schemes run by commercial companies. So here's another one. This is actually parking space for electric scooter on a sidewalk. And I'm not going to say more about it now, but if somebody wants to, we can talk a bit more about it in the Q&A later. So this is a city glider. I don't know if you've seen those, but they start to be a more common feature of our modern urban environment. So here's an electric longboard. And you know when you see one, because it's really intuitive when you see somebody just riding uphill. You know, it's supposed to be the other way around, but whenever you see that, like you know some amazing innovation from the future has just entered your city. So next is electric vehicle charging stations. So you didn't used to see them before, but now these are standing around on the sidewalks. And I love this one. So here's the car bike, or bike car. It has all the features of a car. It has a loading platform. It's the size of a car, but it has pedals and a chain. So it's technically a bike. And so this car is cleverly engineered to not be, needing to comply to the rules of cars. And so you usually see them parked where bikes are parked, also on the sidewalk. This particular one, though, is now parked in a disabled spot. And even the droids. So here are the delivery droids, and I don't know how well you can see it in this picture, but these electric scooters here that had fallen and were lying around on the street, they were in the way of these delivery droids, and it really messed with their AI. So some humans took pity on them and moved the electric scooters, and so the droids can go around and do their work. And all of these phenomena are usually not seen like in separation, but you can see them on the same places because sidewalks are not evenly congested. They're congested on the same places and on the same spaces. So you cannot talk about sidewalks in general. You need to talk about them on specific points of convergence, because that is where the kind of problems appear. And as policymakers, who in here works in a city? Hands up. Okay, so a few. So what we want to do is that we want to create an environment in which the innovation can happen, because we need all of these kind of innovations to make the future of mobility better. But we don't want some of the negative side effects. And so what are some of the negative side effects? When too many of these assets are idle on the same place, like that's not good. And so this is a case of what we don't want. And the next one is also, I would call this overcrowding. Like generally speaking, this is actually pretty cool, but probably also something we would like to avoid. And in order then to formulate policy that makes sense on public space, we need to know like what do we want and what don't we want. And so here's examples of what we don't want. But to a large degree, what we looked at and these phenomena, they are driven by commercial businesses today. And so it's also useful as a policymaker to understand how do those decisions, how are they made? And I think the most important factor to understand here is unit economics, because that's a calculation that underpins all of these kind of asset contributions. And so unit economics is really the contribution margin is a measure of your per unit profit, and you subtract the variable cost per unit from the sales price of that product or service. Or in plain English, unit economics only consider variables costs, not fixed costs. Okay, so if this is how I operate as a private equity or as a venture capital firm, then I, as a policymaker, need to consider that when I formulate policy. So we're going to look at a case. And this is a scooter case, but it's just to understand the general point. The point here is not to, hang out scooters or anything like that. But if we jump into it, and you take a general city of X, and then I estimate that to meet the demand and have the necessary networking effects where people can actually get my scooters, I need to have a certain spread. And so I need a certain number of units, and that's what I estimate will be the marginal return on my unit economics in that city. But there are other actors, my competitors, and they make essentially the same calculation. And in order to compete then, they need to do that, because if they have less, they will just not have a service that is viable. And this leads to a situation where we're oversaturated or we have too much fixed capacity. And that in turn leads to a lot of things that are just sitting around and not really doing something useful, which is what we don't want. And so if we look at this case and we look at policy, we've got a fixed buy-in permit. And this is a policy that a lot of cities had taken. But the only thing that really happens in that is you create a barrier of entry for other actors. It actually does not impact at all the unit economics calculation. And so it will not influence the fleet size. Whereas a charge for something that is indeed idle would make it into the unit economic calculation. Which makes the first one, which is a fixed unit price, not a good deterrent to the inventory surplus. And worst case, you actually just get even more expensive consumer service or less competition. Whereas the other one will have an effect on that. And so you can really think about these kind of policy from pretty bad to pretty good. And in the worst corner, you have prohibition. Like you say, you cannot do anything that's already going on from one day to the next. Because what happens is whoever invested yesterday makes a big loss today. And that feels very bad. And it feels very bad for everybody else that has an idea that they're going to innovate and use capital to do something useful in the city. And so that really hurts the environment of innovation. The other one, like a fixed cost to operate, best case, it really does nothing. And worst case, it just makes products and services more expensive and reduces competition. And variable cost, that now changes the game. Because instead of who has more capital to make a bigger network of units, you move the game to who can operate this network more effectively, which is essentially what we want, right? Because when the things are being used, they are creating consumer value, value for citizen in your city. But when they're not being used, they are an externality. And then the best way is really to couple that with some forward guidance, where you present your intent over time. Because private companies will interpret your intent, and you can start small and say you'll gradually shift up over a long period of time, and then companies can actually adjust their capital investments so that they make sense. And so here's where going from insight to foresight. And insight you would get from data and looking at what are things and which geographies do I have the problems. But foresight combines that with the vision that you would have in the city. And this is consistent with the principles that are being laid out in the Sustainable Urban Mobility Planning Framework. And this is research sponsored by the European Union, and it's made for the benefit of cities and policymakers. And it really lays out an idea of how to have integrated urban mobility planning. And here's where I'm going to make my last proposition of today. And that is that cities already have the capability in their existing networks and in their existing departments in order to manage and charge for the consumption of public space. And without building any extra capabilities or any extra supplier networks, they can already start to manage this space. For example, space is already used on the roads, which is being regulated. Space is already being used in the parking, which is being regulated. And here you have additional land asset that is very similar in very many aspects, situated only 20, 30 centimeters from the other space and is not fundamentally different. And so there's no reason why cities should not be able to use this in an integrated fashion in the way they think about pricing this public space too. And my advice here would, of course, be to start small with the geographies that have the biggest problems, and also start small in terms of the variable fees that are applied, and then guide for the intent towards the future. And a final word of warning for policymakers, because we usually don't know what consumers are going to want to do. And they rarely end up wanting to do what you had in mind from the beginning. Especially probably politicians, but also private companies, they do not know what the future looks like. And because we don't know what the future looks like, but we know it needs to be better than today, we need to create the environment in which that tomorrow can grow. And so it needs to be good today, but it needs to have the chance to get better tomorrow. And for that reason, less firm and more interpretative. As if you think of the case with scooters, if you define rules and regulations for those in particular, you have everything from urban gliders to electric longboards that could easily be substitutes. And what you don't want is a code that is so precise that you need to articulate every item, but something like is being used on roads that is more general and can regulate the consumption of public space. So with that, thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you, thank you. Are there any questions? Because we still have time. So are there any questions here?
Thank you. You were mentioning forward guidance. Could you maybe exemplify a bit more, elaborate on how cities should use this?
Yeah, so forward guidance, that's kind of what central banks do when they talk about the interest rate, and they give you a heads up of what their intent is in the future, and you can adapt to that already today. And I think cities could make great use of that in many different ways in terms of stating what their intent is. And that can separate your action in time. So you can say something today, but you can guide for that tomorrow, and then you can guide further on the direction of something. And that makes it possible to address something that is maybe a big problem, and you're not ready to act on it tomorrow. So, for example, if somebody has made a big investment today, and if I tomorrow change the conditions, that will make a really outsized effect on what I've made. Or it might have an outsized effect on businesses or groups of people or something like that. But if that can be spread over time, that effect is much smaller and also a lot less politically explosive, but also a lot less practically a problem for businesses or groups of people, and can be managed in a smoother way. Thank you for the question.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks for your presentation. I have a question regarding your case study. You mentioned that almost 75% of the scooters are idle, but the problem would be most of the times they will be stacked somewhere, for example, next to the train stations or universities, and not all of them are working always. Some of them are out of the battery or just not working. How we could address this to have enough parking for the one that actually working and address the rebalancing issue?
Yeah, so again, the example is just an example of how you get to an oversupply. So it's not a data point of what it actually looks like somewhere. But that said, I think that what you don't want is when they're idle. And so I think idle should have a price. But it should be that idle makes sense for a little period of time, meaning I drop it off, maybe somebody doesn't pick it up straight away. But what is that natural idle time that it could be allowed before it moves? And that could be different in different geographies, because depending on where it's standing, it's a different problem if it stands there. If it sits on a piece of real estate or sidewalk that is otherwise not used much, it might not need a price at all. But if it sits in a place where, people are walking with their prams, or these droids are doing the deliveries for people, or whatever else is going on there, then it might be a problem. And so I think there isn't one answer, but I think that the answer is still, in principle, that the thing that you don't want is what should be priced, meaning that the asset is idle.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. So you talked a little bit about forward guidance. In the US, we have something that has popped up because of the COVID pandemic, and that's what we call streeteries. Sometimes they're in a parking space, sometimes they're on the sidewalk. When you're thinking about the potential investment, in something that's temporary, what is the thought on maybe streeteries, and do you roll them back after the pandemic, the capital investment? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So thank you for that question. I think this really touches the forward guidance question, because as a result of the pandemic, cities acted and then gave space to entrepreneurs. Like, you can set up shop here, which was street or sidewalk. But now that things are returning to normal, like, what do you tell these guys? How do you roll that back, or should you even roll that back? And I think here's an example of, if you just walk up and roll that back and say, actually, it wasn't allowed, like, please shut down your business today. It's like, but man, you asked me to set up my shop here, and now you want me to remove it. And so that's not very nice. And I think politicians, they need to take responsibility for what they did. But if this space does have price, I think forward guidance here can really help. Because if you guide what this space is now going to cost as an additional charge for this business for being on this space, if consumers are then ready to pay more to use these services there, it means that the city is willing to have it there. The residents want that to be there, and then it can sustain that charge, and then it's fine that it stays. If it can't, it probably can't meet its opportunity cost and should probably be removed. And here's a case where that can be over time. And what's a reasonable time for a streetery? I don't know. Is that a 1-year guidance or a 2-year guidance but I think that could be figured out. But that's how I would think about it probably.
Thank you, Marius, for your presentation. And did you all like the presentation? Can you give a warm applause, please? Thank you.
Thank you.